Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is Darren McDonald. I'm the Director of Safety Services at Construction Safety Nova Scotia, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So just a little bit about me, and then I'll turn it over to our speaker. It's my 30th year in health and safety. I'm a professional ergonomist by trade. Most of my work's been across North America, with the focus on improving health, safety, and operational efficiency. And today, I'm really happy to be spending my time here in Nova Scotia with Construction Safety Nova Scotia. For those of you that aren't familiar with our organization, we're industry-funded and founded nonprofit dedicated to improving occupational health and safety outcomes across the construction sector. We roughly serve 6,000 member companies across the province, all of which are automatically enrolled through our worker compensation classification system here. Over the years, we've trained more than 380,000 students, helped over 1,000 firms annually achieve their core certification, and developed a reputation for delivering high quality safety training, mentorship, and consulting. But we're not just about checklists and compliance. Our mission is to help businesses build a strong safety culture, one that helps workers run safe activities, operations that run smoothly, and employers that are informed and supported. And that's exactly what we're doing here today. So our session is focused on our current reality, drugs and alcohol in the workplace. So substance use is one of the most complex and sensitive issues in health and safety today. While policies often focus heavily on detection and discipline, many employers are still struggling with that uncertainty of whether it's identifying use, navigating privacy concerns, or knowing exactly what to do when there's a positive result. So what makes this even harder is the lack of specific legislation to guide employers, which leads to a lot of myths and misconceptions, particularly regarding around testing and in unionized environments, so on and such. So to help us cut through the noise and get to the facts, we're pleased to host Nadine Wenzel here today. Nadine's a consultant pharmacist, the founder and director of Nadine Wenzel Consulting, Inc., bringing 30 years of experience helping employers address substance use in the workplace. She's a leading voice on drug and alcohol testing and policy modernization, with a specific focus on evidence-based approaches, especially regarding cannabis. Her work is grounded in science, that's probably why we get along, facts and best practices. She's a strong advocate for collaborative case management to help support recovery and sustainable reintegration. So Nadine's here to help us modernize our thinking, debunk some myths around testing, and walk us through components of good policy. And she's helped us here at CSNS do exactly that. So before I hand it over to Nadine, I just wanted to let you know a couple of quick housekeeping tips. Your mics and cameras are turned off so you can sit back, focus, maybe enjoy your lunch as you listen to our speaker. If you have a question, pop it in the chat at any time. And we're going to circle back at the end of the presentation to review the questions in a Q&A format. For those of you that are interested in coming on screen, we have the ability to turn your camera on, but in lieu of that, we'll just hear your beautiful voice ask the question, Nadine. Yes, the recording will be posted on our website, and any resources shared, we'll do that post-session. So a huge thank you to Nadine for joining us here today to share her expertise on such a critical topic. Let's get started. I'll leave the screen and over to you, Nadine.
Thank you, Darren. That was very comprehensive and I have a lot to live up to, so I'll do my best. I have learned a lot over those 30 years, and I've often said this, the more I learn, the more I know how little I know, how much more there is to learn. So always learning, that's the most important thing. Okay, so here's my slide. Just again, I'd like to have this visual because it's really a mixture of everything, especially these days of polydrug use, that we don't know what's going on, and it could be all kinds of things. So it's just a visual to help focus the session. So as a licensed pharmacist, I still am. I am required and under regulation to let you know if I have any conflicts of interest. As far as I know, I don't. I've been self-employed for 30 years. I do not have any current or past relationships with any commercial entities, pharmaceutical, cannabis production or retail company, or any endorsement thereof. If I mention a drug, I will do my best to mention the generic name as well as the common brand name, but it's not meant to sound like I'm an affiliate or representing or recommending anything. So it's important that you're clear on that. Another important part is that what I'm going to speak with you about today is information and facts that I've learned over this period of time. It's not intended to be considered as legal advice or a substitute for legal advice. And just, as a note, in the work that I do, when policies are written, I always require my clients to have their internal legal counsel or whoever they contract as for their employer law components to make sure that it's defensible by them. And as an FYI, the policies I've written have been vetted through arbitrations and human rights tribunals and never had any problems or anything that looked untoward or out of sort. So if I share any client-specific cases or information, it's of course fact-based and only with their permission, because I always ask that in advance. And CSNS has sponsored me to do this, and I'm very grateful to them and happy to be here. So that's my long disclaimer. Okay, so learning objectives is pretty much what Darren just said. I want to hopefully identify some challenges and some misconceptions and clarify those. Similarly with facts, separate facts from fiction. We're going to look at the components of a good, quote unquote, drug and alcohol policy, the next steps, one after a positive test, and key components of a collaborative case managed return to work program. So that's a lot to do in a very short period of time. I'm going to do my best to keep it at high level. And then if you have specific questions about anything I say or any of these learning objectives, please identify them in the chat as Darren has asked you to do. And then I will do my best to answer them at the end. Okay, so let's get going. To frame this overarching component, I always like to make sure that these key points are front and center. So first of all, we know that the use, misuse, and abuse, and generally today, the term is supposed to be most effectively, the most destigmatizing is substance use. But we also still use misuse and abuse of psychoactive substances. Whatever words we use, it is definitely real. My focus is always on fitness for duty and a health and safety focus. Probably we started doing this a long time ago as a pharmacist. Even before I started pharmacy school, I was interested in addiction and treatment and all those sorts of things. So it's been with me for a long time. And there's a lot of controversy about where the employer falls in this area. I always approach it from substance use disorder is a medical disease, a medical illness. I don't like saying disease, but it's a medical situation that needs to be addressed appropriately and fairly from a medical perspective. And that's how it is most effectively managed. Stigma and judgment versus humanness. We all have stigma and judgment because all of us, I don't think there's anyone that I've ever found with any exception, has had some connection to someone with a substance use issue or problem. And that experience is rarely positive. And so whether or not we recognize it front and center, we've got often unconscious biases that impact how we interact with people who have substance use issues and or work we're doing around that to support people who have substance use disorders. So just to be aware of that. And the most important thing when you're dealing in this sphere, in this sector, policy, testing, anything related to an individual where they're impacted, it's very important to be consistent, to be fair, and to be respectful. So those three key pieces are really important. Okay, so I mentioned multi-substance use, polydrug use, et cetera, and I just want to go through this quite briefly at a high level. And it's important to know that any one of these substances in and of themselves can be psychoactive. When you combine two or more, you get a synergistic effect, which means the two put together have a greater impact than either one used in isolation. So it just magnifies it even more. Alcohol is still number one, way up there on the top of our list, and especially so in Atlantic Canada. We have a history of hundreds of years of alcohol use, misuse, abuse. Benzodiazepines, things like Valium and Ativan, and the generic names are diazepam, lorazepam, I always say clonazepam, and any other damn Pam there is. If the generic word ends in a Pam, it's a benzodiazepine. They're sedatives. They're used to help treat alcohol use disorder. They're also highly prescribed, overused, misused because they are so prevalent and they are so popular. Cannabis, of course, Delta-9 THC is the active component. There are over, I think, 150 identified chemovars now, chemicals within the cannabis plant. But the one we're most concerned about is the Delta-9, because in our world, that's the one that's most psychoactive. Then we have the stimulants. Cocaine is number 3 or 4 on the list of prevalence here in Canada. Cocaine / methamphetamines, amphetamines. So those are the top ones, and that's why there's a little bit of a space between the two. Believe it or not, prescription narcotics are below that. As are stimulants. Prescription stimulants now are what I'm talking about, and antidepressants and anti-anxiety agents. And there's all kinds of others as well. But those are the key ones that will certainly impact us from a cognitive perspective. And we don't always think of the expanded group of drugs that are not on that list that many people test for. And then there's the over-the-counter medications. You're in the construction industry. You've got a lot of people taking muscle relaxants. Antihistamines, probably in the wintertime. Most of them, thankfully now, are not sedating, but some of them are. And another one, an anti-nauseant. I would not expect you'd have too many people using anti-nauseants like Gravol, diphenhydramine, or dimenhydrinate. Either one of those. The antihistamine is the one I said first. Those can certainly cause sleepiness, grogginess, cognition concerns. So the point of this is to help you realize that it's not just, even if you're doing a testing program and you have a robust program, doesn't mean that you're covering everything, because there's so much more around that is just part of our reality in most cases. And it's more important to know your people, because there's no way you could ever put a testing program in place where you could test for all of this. It wouldn't be manageable and it would cost a fortune. So just to be aware, that's the reason I wanted to mention those. So the other thing that is really important is to think about wherever you are within your organization, what's your motivation to have some information or to have a program at all? Are you checking a box because you know it's the right thing to do? Or you're being told you have to do it? And then think about the messaging that sends, because that attitude or that perspective will be reflected in how you interact with your employees, and everyone who comes in contact with your business. Or is it the other? And you know that this is probably the one that I'm always happy to hear, that employers want to invest in their people. So, are you interested in getting accurate current knowledge? And do you have a culture of caring? Do you want to support people? And then what are the details around that? And what about immediate reporting? Reasonable cause is the lowest area, or the area where we had the most infrequent reporting and requirement for testing, because everyone's too afraid to do anything. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, which if we have time, I can talk about if you want me to. And then what do you do after that? So that means what happens after the positive test, which is what we're going to cover a bit as well today. So a couple things to think about, again, to situate this. So from an employer's perspective, what do you care about? Hopefully safety and due diligence are at the top of the list. And I know everyone on this call probably knows exactly what that is. The other thing that's a reality today is attraction and retention of employees. It just is. And, I can't tell you the number of people that say, well, if I test for cannabis, or they usually say pot, if I test for pot, then I'm not going to have any employees. Well, I have circumstances where I can prove to you that has been the opposite. It's often, I don't know if it's an excuse, but I do believe it's a true belief that a lot of people have. And in many cases, especially in the US now, they're not testing for cannabis, which is, unless it's a federally regulated employer under transportation, then there's no decision there. It's an obligation. What is your workplace culture? I have had some employers who have come to me because they know they have a substance use issue. And so how aware are you? Do you have a culture that is a focus on health and safety? Do you have a subculture that has an area of drug use? So it's something to be aware of. And obviously you want the former and not the latter. Human rights, sometimes people get human rights and employee rights mixed up. Human rights is related to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in that substance use disorder is a protected grounds under the Charter. So if an individual is found to have a substance use disorder, the employer is obligated to accommodate that individual. Employee rights is more related to privacy, in that an individual's personal private medical information is just that, it's theirs, and the employer has no right to that unless there are seriously extenuating circumstances, and only with the consent of the employee. And this often comes in around testing, and I've had too many employers want to know too much information which they were not legally able, or should not have legally been able to attain. And it does not end well when that happens. And then the last one is the collective agreements. Some employers find this very frustrating, but from my perspective, I appreciate it, because often when I'm working with a group of people, we'll bring in one of the union representatives or more to sit in on the conversations. And actually, in several cases, they've suggested wording for certain sections of the policy that I wouldn't have thought about. So, and it helps. It doesn't just give the appearance of it, truly is meaning that you're integrating and involving everyone. So it goes back to that collaboration thing that I'm so keen on. The other thing is collective agreements are there to support the employee, and they often may have a component about testing. Most of them don't, but some of them do. So that if it's the latter, then the employer, of course, has to be aware of that and make sure that they include it. So that's sort of where the employer is coming from what I see. And then the other side of the employees, well, hopefully you see some similarities here. You've got safety, of course. Now, I always get, well, it's legal, so it's harmless. Well, not really, because if you think about alcohol, it's been legal for a long time, and it's certainly not harmless. So this is usually in context with cannabis. And so the second statement that's usually made is, what I do in my own time is my own business. And I say, yep, absolutely. Yeah, I've got no argument there. But when an individual uses a substance that then ripples over into and impacts their ability to be safe at work, then it is the employer's business. So that line is a very, very important one. And then going back to what I said about at the beginning, the fairness of testing. Is it fair? Is it meeting the needs of the intent? And are people aware of all of the particulars? Again, that transparency is really important, because there's so much misinformation around this whole topic, as Darren alluded to at the beginning. The most important thing is to be open, because otherwise people are going to be suspicious and you won't get compliance. You will drive many things underground. Being consistent so that you're not treating different people differently depending on their role within the organization is another one. I've already talked about human rights and privacy. Those are key things. And collective agreements, again, those can be very helpful. And I know in my clients that I work with, when we do the return to work part, we will bring in the union. So we write it together. I usually work together with the HR person. We write the return to work agreement, and then we bring in the collective agreement people, the union people. It could be a steward, it could be a president, it could be whoever, depends on where I am. But I love that, because they will ask questions that I haven't thought about, and it makes everything better, and it makes it more robust. So, and then there's the actual return to work agreement. I really, really, really dislike last chance agreements, because rarely are they last chance agreements. And doesn't last chance agreement word terminology, doesn't that just warm the cockles of your heart? Doesn't it make you want to come back to work and feel that you're welcome? It certainly doesn't. So the language, and you'll notice me, and Darren and I have chatted about this before, the language is really important. How you frame things and what your culture is, those things will dramatically impact how your employees are going to feel about any drug and alcohol program you choose to put in place. And you'll notice I'm saying program, because a lot of people focus solely on the policy, and that is important, but it's the foundational piece. What you do around it is the program, and the program supports the policy. And that's the part that people often forget or they don't consider. Okay, so I want to talk about quickly cannabis and other drugs, standards and sources. We've got our active substance, THC versus CBD. A lot of people think that CBD is psychoactive. It's not, but it's also not innocuous either. It has its own concerns because of some of the actions of some of the substance has on some areas of our body. The benefit here in Canada is with Health Canada licensure, we have that for prescription substances. We also have retail substances, businesses, who are licensed, who are obligated to report the concentrations of THC and CBD. In the US, that's not the case. It's a free-for-all. It's like the Wild West, and it's a zoo. So at least we have some quantification here. However, that ends if your people are using substances that are not regulated, if they get them from dispensaries, or I hate that term because dispensary in my world always referred to a pharmacy, but if they have them purchased from non-licensed shops, then the quantification is usually not there. And online, it's a free-for-all. And that's not just for THC, it's for any substance. There's, health food store products, there's all kinds of pharmaceuticals that really, it's so accessible these days. So we really don't know a lot if we don't purchase, or if the people who are using these substances don't purchase from reliable sources. And then I've already talked about the concentrations and the product options. So again, thinking about the source, and I know for me, probably because of my background, when someone says prescription drug, I think, oh, that's something that they got from a pharmacy. Well, not necessarily, because it's just as easy to get something on the internet if you don't have a prescription or you don't want to be connected to a certain substance. Okay, so again, the use of the substance, how are people consuming? Well, obviously orally for prescriptions and others, but not exclusively. I tend to think of smoking more with cannabis or a certain cocaine, like smoking and other substances, vaping certainly with cannabis. And then there are other ways. If people are trying to hide injection use, they'll often inject between the webs of their fingers or toes, and there's all kinds of other things. Sometimes alcohol is taken rectally because the absorption is quicker. And so again, not to be suspicious, even that word is not a good one to use, but not to be naive enough to think that just because you don't see someone taking something orally or smoking something, that they haven't taken something and it's in their body, because there are many ways. Darren's also mentioned the word of detection. So if you're doing testing, I encourage people to use the word identification. It's very innocuous, but it gets the same point across, and it's much less offensive to most people. And then I've already talked about workplace culture. And the problem we have in Canada is we have a lot of normalization. We've had it for alcohol for years, and now equally, if not more so, with cannabis. And so it's a reality that many employers struggle with. And the most important, or the best way to deal with it, really is through education. And I'll talk a little more about that. So I've already said this, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe, specifically with cannabis. And it doesn't mean you can use it anywhere, anytime. What it does mean is that regardless of what the substance is, poor performance or behavior will be disciplined. So that line is really, really important. Canadian Cannabis Survey is done every year. If you Google it, you can find it. This is just a little bit of the information that's there. And I wanted to show you this basically to identify that in the year that cannabis was legalized, and it was the fall of 2018, of course, the percentage of people using cannabis was 22. That's gone up to as high as 27. And then within the last 2 years, it's been steady at 26. And then you've got use per province. This survey usually comes out in December of each year. So if you want to go online, I'd say mid-December. If you're interested in the most current information, that's where you'll find it. The same survey tells us the frequency of cannabis use. And what was found from the one in 2024 was 32% of people using cannabis were using it 3 or more days a week. And 23% were using it 5 or more days a week. So think about that. If you have people in your employ who are cannabis consumers, there's a good possibility that if they're comfortable using it on a regular basis, they could fall into this latter category. And that means that I can say with pretty darn good certainty, if they were tested with an oral fluid test, they would probably test positive, because at that frequency, they're going to have circulating THC, Delta 9 THC. Okay, so again, a little bit more education around cannabis. There's the acute stuff. If you're smoking it, it'll get into your system and into your brain in about 5 to 10 minutes, and the effects will last for 4 hours or less. Orally is concerning because people can take gummies to work or any kind of food to work, and it can be cannabis inside. It can be infused with cannabis. And what happens with people who are cannabis naive, or edible naive more likely, is if they take one and they expect to feel something within a half an hour and they don't, then they'll take a second and then maybe a third. So you know what happens. It's a cumulative effect. And the problem is that effect usually lasts for about 6 to 8 hours. So, and generally, we don't grow as tolerant to oral or edible cannabis as we do to smokable cannabis. And that effect can last for up to 24 hours or longer. So even though these are averages, it's variable depending on the concentrations. And right now in Canada, we have concentrations from retail providers that are up to 95% THC. So that's pretty darn high. And if someone is using a product at that percentage of THC, every day, I would be surprised if they didn't have active THC circulating at any one time if an oral test was done. And then more importantly, or equally, if not more importantly, and certainly concerning, is that people are using substances daily. Even if it's in the evening, they're going to have more buildup in their system, because I've mentioned that cannabis is unlike any other drug I know. It's fat soluble, and I've been a pharmacist a long time, and I haven't seen anything that acts like this. It's fat soluble. It means it sticks to our fat cells in our brain and all other parts of our body. And what that means is it also takes a long time to be eliminated. Alcohol is easy from a calculation perspective, because if we're healthy, we eliminate a drink an hour. Cannabis isn't like that. The more we consume, the more it builds up, and it's released gradually over a period of time. And I've had some people who were testing to try and get them to a baseline below which would trigger a positive test result, and it's taken 2 to 3 months. People who were heavy consumers, bigger body, larger, heavier people, so that would account partially the fat component, but not necessarily, not exclusively. So it's important to know, because the effects that go with that, the adverse effects, are particularly around learning, concentration, and memory. Less so with the visual, auditory, and the time distortions, but any of those are possible. And the more someone's consuming, the more prevalent this is going to be. And the duration, as I've already alluded to, can last for weeks, months, or years. And then the concern is always the timeline between use and work. Okay, so now I want to get to solutions. How are we doing for time? Okay, I want to make sure we leave lots of time for questions. So solutions as to how to address this. Well, first of all, what I'm giving you is what I hope you will find helpful and may be valuable for you from an education perspective with your employees. So I like to show this slide because it identifies the complexity of the impact of cannabis or any other substance. So this is not exclusively for cannabis. I'm going to talk about all substances now. There's many areas of the brain. Alcohol and cannabis certainly affect all of these, if not more, and other substances more or less to certain degrees, depending on the chemical nature of the substance and how all those variables, again, how often it's consumed, et cetera, et cetera. So emotions on the top right here, it impacts an individual's ability to manage their frustrations, and more commonly to keep on an even keel, to modulate those highs and lows that may have. And of course, you see that as an example when someone is using a stimulant. That's a very difficult situation to moderate your emotions appropriately. Self-monitoring, so the self-awareness of what's going on. Am I compromised? Am I maybe not in the best frame of mind to be able to be doing this right now? Are my actions consistent with what I should be able to do? What about flexibility, the ability to shift attention from one thing to another? If you're in a work environment where there's a lot going on, can you maintain that attention for where it needs to be? Are you good at sequencing? Or is that all? Those are things that can be all compromised. And going along the bottom, memory. So that's utilizing working memory. Again, going back to, if you've got sequences that are expected to be followed, that could be compromised. The focus on sustaining focus, being alert, and being able to provide consistent effort. And another that comes from another part of the brain. These are all areas of executive functioning of our brain that we need to be safe in safety sensitive positions. And then there's the activation, the planning portion that's related to organizing and prioritizing, and actually even just getting to work. So when we think about this, we don't always realize that the effect is, again, it's like multiple substances, it's cumulative. The effect on our brain, that the accumulation of that effect of many substances means that it has a greater impact on our brain. And the other thing that often happens is if we're using substances with relative frequency, that can expand and accumulate over time. And when I talk about this, it makes me think about two individuals, no, actually 3 or 4 individuals that I've had the privilege of working with who had cannabis use disorder, and they wanted to withdraw from cannabis use so that they could continue to work in safety sensitive positions. 2 things that they said to me, and none of these people know each other. One is, wow, I had no idea how much this had impacted me and how much I wasn't getting. And the second is, wow, I'm clear. I feel clear again. So I just find it very interesting that self-awareness has been consistent when cannabis use was no longer detectable in their system, and they had a completely different perspective. And they said, you know, this has accumulated over time. It's built up, and I wasn't aware of it. So it can be very cagey. So what's the big deal? All of these impacts, bottom line, all of these impacts that impact our brain in many different ways impact safety risk. There is a direct correlation in every way, shape, and form. And people don't always make that connection. The priority and the individual right to use a substance often gets so great that individuals forget about, well, I really need to consider how this is impacting not just my safety, but the safety of everybody I'm working with too. Okay, so I also like to say that testing is not the only option. So this is the standard panel that most employers will test for. Fentanyl is one that not everyone does, nor are the benzodiazepines. But this is the standard panel. It comes from the U.S. Department of Transportation, and it's there are some things here that I wouldn't recommend, like PCP. our labs here have never had a positive PCP test, for one. And heroin, same thing. Heroin metabolites quite quickly to morphine anyway, so you're going to pick it up as morphine. So what are the alternatives for testing? Well, first of all, I want to look at what are the types of specimens that can be analyzed. Blood, not from a workplace perspective, no. Although when I was working with a large company who had affiliates in the Caribbean, one of the collective agreements included blood testing, which shocked the heck out of me. It wasn't being used or it wasn't being applied, but it certainly was possible because of the collective agreement. Oral fluid is the quickest test to do. It's easy to do. It's non-invasive, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more a bit later. But the bottom line is oral fluid is the type of testing you want to do if you're testing for reasonable cause or post-incident. It is the only test that will give you active drug. And that's the only thing you should be looking for if you're looking for a workplace safety sensitive position where an individual's ability to function effectively and safely could be compromised. Urine, yeah, you can test, as you know, and I've already alluded to, up to weeks you could have a positive test in urine, but that will only give you an inactive metabolite. There is no way that you can equate that to a reasonable cause test of someone being safe or not, or having a chemical in their system that was active at the time. Hair and nails much longer, generally 3 months or longer, depending on the length of the hair or the nail and the specimen that's taken and how it's taken. But most of the time, this is reserved solely for situations of child custody in court proceedings and things like that. So in the US, there are some companies that do hair testing, but in Canada, it's viewed to be too invasive because there's no way you can discern use between private time versus work time. So I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure I keep saying this, that I have time for questions. So I want to go through this one because it's an important one. Oops, now hold on. I'm not able to get my cursor, there we go. Okay, sorry, that's a problem with my technology ability here, the lack thereof. So when can an employer test? This is something that many people ask about. Well, many do test for pre-employment. So it's I have a story I can tell you about that if we have time later. But generally, it could be urine or oral fluid. It depends on what the reason is for testing. Pre-site access testing is specific to if there's contractors, usually is when this is applied. When an owner or a contractor or whoever the client is has property that they own, that they will not allow people on that site until they have a negative drug and alcohol test. And again, that could be oral fluid or urine. Reasonable cause and post-incident. I've already talked about those, and they're pretty self-explanatory. In my world, it makes no sense, and I can't see how it would ever be legally defensible to do any testing other than oral fluid. Return to work, that will depend on the circumstances of why the person was absent, what the chemical was, what the requirement is for their ongoing return to work. It could be urine or oral fluid or both. So that's individual, depending on a case-by-case basis. And then the last one is unannounced. Many employers choose to do unannounced testing for a whole host of reasons. And if it's in a unionized environment, a non-unionized environment, that's more apt to happen. And if it was in a unionized environment, in my experience, it would only be able to be done, and I'd recommend that a client get legal advice on this, but I've never seen it done without there at least being an agreement in principle by the employees to have this unannounced testing. And again, that could be oral or urine, could be based on what the reason is for the testing. So it's not just yay or nay, there's often many parameters around, well, what kind of test are we doing and why? Okay, so I've already talked about urine testing. It's an inactive metabolite. THC is positive for 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes more. Then there's the ick factor of just having to provide a urine specimen. And there's all kinds of ways to beat the test, as I'm sure many of you are aware. The internet's just rife with them. The one that I like to reference and people kind of raise their eyebrows is the Whizzinator. Apparently for men, there's many different shapes, color, sizes of a male penis, so that even if it's observed, someone could be fooled by something that's not really an anatomically attached appendage, and it always, of course, then would have fake urine. And in Canada, observed testing doesn't usually happen. It would have to be an extenuating circumstance. I've never seen it, but in the US, it's very popular, especially if there's a negative drug test, positive drug test. Then the next time that testing is required for usually at least a year, if not longer, every time the test is done, it's observed by usually someone of the same gender. And then there's challenges with having said that, with observed or monitored testing. Okay, so the benefits of oral fluid, I've already highlighted. Active drug, you can direct it with safety. You can link it directly with safety. I don't use the word impairment because impairment is a very broad topic, and there is no way that the result of a particular oral fluid or urine test will be able to be linked to impairment. It's just not possible. But you can link it to safety risk because the levels that we test at or above, mean that there's enough active drug in an individual's system, in their blood, that, or the saliva, or both, that they are not safe to work. So that means further investigation. It doesn't mean that they're identified as someone who is impaired at work. Alcohol is a little different because of the history we have with that. So that link is always made, and it has been made for over 50, 60 years now. Employees like it a whole lot more. It's obviously observed. The collection is easy, and it can often give you, if you're in a remote situations, particularly initial information on whether or not you need to stand someone down or if they're safe to go back to work. And then there's also, ironically, maybe not, a greater positivity rate because of the observation. That's the general reason that's equated with that. So you can see my reminder here on the bottom that safety risk is not a measure of impairment. So that's a really important piece. And then, okay, so we have a positive test. Now what? Well, the first step is to determine whether or not an individual has a substance use disorder. And the person that does that is a substance use expert. That's not me, but I have colleagues and clinicians all over the country that do this every day. So that means that it's an individual one-on-one assessment with the employee and the expert. And what they will determine, they'll go through a number of psychometric tests and a very comprehensive psychosocial history and look at the job description and a whole host of things. And they'll make a determination as to whether or not an individual has a substance use disorder. This is the key piece that most employers either aren't aware of or they miss. And it's very critical because from that, it determines whether or not the person was using recreationally or they legitimately have a medical condition. If it's the latter, then the employer has that duty to accommodate. Now, the beauty of this is when the substance use expert does their assessment, they also include recommendations as to what that particular person needs to be healthy and then to be able to come back to work. So this is the sort of thing that I case manage, and it's really interesting to see how it works because the report from the substance use expert basically forms the foundation of the return to work agreement. And it's supported by the fact that it's not anything that an employer is requiring an employee to do, that they're not being informed about because they're being informed about what the specifics are by an expert. So the potential for it to be successfully challenged are much lower. The other benefit is that it's customized and it's time and cost effective because not everyone needs a residential treatment program or needs 2 sessions of counseling twice a month for 2 years. So it works to everyone's advantage, and especially for the employee, because that way they know that it's not a judgment call or that it's not something that is not based on best practices. It's basically something that's done by someone independently, and it's fair and it's consistent. So the resources that may be accessed as part of that return to work process can be EAP or EFAP, Employee Assistance Program, or Employee and Family Assistance Program. Many companies have extended health benefits that have support for psychologists or mental health and addictions counseling. And there's a whole host of other things that could be recommended, NA, AA. And even if you're in rural areas, that's the beauty of being able to go online these days. You can still access many of the resources that in the past we couldn't. So I've mentioned the return to work agreement that will mirror the recommendations for return to work that the substance abuse expert, or I just said it, abuse instead of use, substance use expert recommends. And again, it should be reasonable. Of course, fitness for duty is an expectation, and the individual has to follow all of the requirements, including there's usually a very rigorous follow-up testing program that, again, is recommended by that external person. So the employer is removed from being even possibly perceived to be making judgment calls or trying to be overly harsh or overly lenient on the employee. And the other thing I've already mentioned, the return to work and having the union and the labor people involved involved, because it really does help. It helps make sure, and certainly from an optics perspective for the rest of your employees, they know that there's oversight and accountability. And that's the other thing, that when I case manage these things, I will liaise with, again, with the consent of the employee, the treatment providers. Now, I'm not asking what they're talking about or anything other than, are they attending? Are they participating, and are they making progress? So then I can report that back to the employer, and there's an accountability piece there, because often when people are off work because of substance use issues, they're left languishing. There's very little contact with the employer or anybody, and they have to maneuver through whatever's being required of them with very little support. So I can tell you that this is consistent with best practices internationally, and it's also a program that was implemented with the Construction Owners Association of Alberta over 30 years ago. They use the term substance abuse professional, substance abuse expert, but that's the only difference. The process is very much the same. Doing this in the States is usually arbitrary and infrequent. So it's quite a difference. Again, the approach generally on substance use in the States is very punitive and not really supportive of the individual. And then most equally, if not more importantly, is the training and education, so that everyone in your work environment has some information around these pieces that I've talked to you about. Because the more information you provide to people, the better they're going to understand what's going on. They will not hopefully think of it as I test positive, I lose my job, because that's what's often included, or the perception of a policy that uses the words zero tolerance, because it's perceived to mean if I have a positive test, I'm toast. Usually when an employer puts that in a policy, it means that there's no acceptance of people being under the influence of any substance while at work. Doesn't mean that they're going to be terminated. But that distinction is very rarely made. And if the word zero tolerance, as an example, are in a policy, it's going to drive substance use underground. If you have a program that supports people returning to work like this, it changes the dynamic 180 on a dime, because people finally realize that they can come forward. That's another component. And I'm going to go now to the policy so that we can talk about this. Voluntary disclosure is a key piece of any policy, where if an individual has an issue or substance use concern and they come forward and they haven't been required to have a test, or they haven't been disciplined, then they can go through that same process I've just identified without any disciplinary action. And that is the best thing you can have in your policy to changing the attitudes and having people come forward to address mental health issues, because that's what a substance use disorder is. So in addition to that to me is, of course, the priority. Think about the focus. It's really important at the beginning of your policy that you identify the why. Is it focused on health and safety, or is it just zero tolerance? Very big difference. And who does it apply to? So of course, all your employees, safety sensitive or not, maybe. Some more and more, the companies I work with, the policy is applied across the board. In addition to that, what about your contractors? That's one where most employers struggle, because it's really hard to be consistent with your contractors. So there's usually a special section for contractors, and there needs to be a defined process as to how they're made aware of what the expectations are of them. Definitions, things like, well, what's a substance use expert? What's a safety sensitive position? What's things like a medical review officer, which is an integral part of the testing process. Those things need to be defined. Again, it's the transparency piece, so that if your people have questions, there it is. The area where most people focus the most attention are the work rules. In other words, I call them the thou shalt nots. Of course, fitness for duty. You can't have alcohol in your system above a level of 0.04. You can't have substances in your system at the levels that are defined, and usually that's also identified in your policy. And again, transparency is important. Individuals like to know, well, what's the level? They may not know how it applies or what it means, but just so that they know that, again, it's the employers being open with them about it. And then the testing. What happens under all those circumstances that I identified? Do you decide you're going to test in all those circumstances? And if you do, what type of testing are you going to do? Again, your employees want to know. And then the consequences of a positive drug test. Lab-based drug testing is the only testing that you should ever take operational action on. We have quick tests that exist that are unreliable. There's lots of false positives and false negatives. That's my general perspective. If you're choosing to do a quick test, or a point of collection test as it's referred to, you need to follow up with a lab-based test of the same specimen. We've got a lot of American companies right now in Canada, and companies that are influenced by American companies that are doing a quick test urine test because it's been done forever. And then if that's positive, which it often is for THC, they're sending an oral fluid off to the lab, which is going to be negative for THC 9 times out of 10. So it's a waste of time and money, and it doesn't tell you what you're really looking for, because in many of those cases, you're going to miss cocaine because of the timeline of use. Cocaine dissipates much quicker than in urine, than metabolite in urine, than any other substance. And more importantly, from an employer perspective, is your employees, if you're doing that, following that process I just identified, your employees are going to know, and you're going to have a higher incidence of cocaine use. I would bet my dollars to donuts on it. The support is really critical. Again, what options are available for your people may be supported through some of your extended health benefits, but they will be supported in return to work. And the goal is to get them back to work. And then again, I've already talked about the education and training. Okay, so this is my last slide, well, second to last slide. Education is the most important thing, and it needs to be done with everybody. And it needs to focus on the fact that we all have that internal responsibility for the health and safety of everybody, not just ourselves, but everybody. Supervisors, risk mitigation training. I don't call it reasonable suspicion, because how supportive does that sound? Why are we doing this? Well, you're trying to mitigate the risk of people who could be using substances. That's why I use these words. And you may think that it's a bit woo-woo-y or a bit soft, but I can tell you it makes a huge difference. If I'm doing a training session and I talk about impairment, everybody just kind of sits back because they don't want to do it. And I wouldn't want to do it. And I've been doing this a long time. But if I say safety risk, I can see the attitudes change, the look on people's faces, because they'll say, okay, I can get behind that because that is my responsibility. So it's a huge difference. Managers also need to know about what's going on. So if they're asked, they often may be, maybe not. I don't know. It depends on how visible and how active they are in your organization. But if anything else, from a leadership perspective, they need to know what your program is all about. Two areas that are often not thought about are owners or boards of directors. It's also important that they know, because if anything doesn't go well, there's a potential shared liability. And then contractors, I've already talked about that. Not only is it difficult for employers, but that shared responsibility is something that contractors don't always think about. So education for everybody, most of it all the same, probably less with contractors, because you don't want to take on the burden of having to be responsible for their testing. So it's really important to be clear, and you don't want contractors being treated differently than your own employees. So that's why the contractor situation has to be nuanced a little bit differently. So at the end of the day, the most important thing is to know your people. Know what's normal for them. If I'm normally, really hyper and active, and all of a sudden I'm kind of laid back and not saying a whole lot, then that's a dramatic change. And similarly, if it's the opposite. So the most important thing you can do is educate everybody and help your supervisors and your managers, give them the tools that they need to be able to have conversations, toolbox talks, have them ask questions, and then listen to what the responses are. Too often we ask questions and don't pay attention to what comes afterwards. If you have created the environment where people are comfortable and they feel safe, they will come forward. So if that happens, you need to have a plan as to how you're going to deal with it. Operationally within your organization, what happens? Are they removed from duty? Do you take them to a private space? Who talks to them? What happens? You need to follow up on that. And then make sure that everyone who has those responsibilities is aware of that. And then finally, actually do it, make it happen. So I will go back to the learning objectives that I had at the very beginning. Current challenges and misconceptions, facts and fiction. I gave you a quick highlight of a good policy from my perspective and what happens after a positive test. And that collaborative piece, the return to work piece, the case management piece, the other part of it that's really helpful is I can liaise with the other providers, and then they understand and they work with me. Even family physicians will often say, wow, I've never had anybody do this, let alone know that employers cared enough to be involved in this process. So that collaborative piece is how it's the way of today, and it's going to be the way of the future as we go forward, because it's very, very employer focused. It's employee focused. It's collaborative with the employer, and it supports the whole aspect of psychological health and wellness in the workplace, which is a big priority here in Nova Scotia right now, particularly. Okay, we've got 10 minutes. I was hoping I get quicker, be able to be quicker and have more time for questions, but so I will stop talking and see what people have asked. Darren, was that you that will be doing that?
Yeah, there's a ton of questions in here, so I'll let me pick one, and then
Okay,
we'll try and get to all of them. So
sure.
here's a question from Stacia. How can organizations effectively encourage voluntary disclosure when doing so may result in lost wages? For example, unionized employees may be unpaid during treatment and therefore required to stay off work until they meet the fit for duty criteria. So in these situations, what approaches support disclosure, ensuring safety, particularly when the individual works in a safety sensitive role?
Oh,
Thanks,
that's a
Stacia.
very detailed question. Okay, so it goes back to what I've been saying throughout this, to making sure that you're using the language and you're setting the culture to show that it's supportive, number one. If someone is identified by a substance use expert to have a substance use disorder, even if it's mild, then they have, and again, I'm not familiar with EI or any of the short or long-term disability programs, but that's where HR is very, very helpful. I often find that people, even on short time that they're absent from work, if they only need a couple of weeks or a month or two, short-term disability is what they are able to use. And in the absence of that, usually at least EI medical benefits. Some employers, depending on who they are and how progressive they are, will top up salary to full salary. Because you have to remember that duty to accommodate. And the last part of that is to the point of undue hardship. So if you're a company that is profitable and doing well, it's worthwhile considering covering costs. And again, I can tell you from experience and what the evidence tells us is that when an employer does that, it expedites the employee getting back to work, and the return on investment is phenomenal. I can't remember the number right now, but the time and the money that you spend helping this person and not have to worry about financial stuff, because usually that is the last deciding factor as to whether or not they're going to get help to begin with and be receptive and be proactive. If they have to worry about finances, you may lose them, because that may be something they just can't manage. So I'm going to suggest that you look at it the other way to see about what can be available, how the employer can help. Oh, sorry, I just got a message that someone else was in control of the presentation. It scared me there for a minute.
No worries.
So if you can really help the employee by being actively engaged with accountability, that's a key piece too. There has to be accountability. And that's why having, I'm the gatekeeper. I don't like that word, but I'm the one that monitors or facilitates it. But you could set that up in your own process. It's better that you have someone who's external to your organization. And then that way it gives you some level as an employer of assurance that things are following along as you intend them to, and that you're getting a good return on your investment from the very beginning. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but those are my thoughts. Darren, did I miss anything there?
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and we'll connect folks with you if they have further questions. And there's contact information as well on the screen.
Right.
So I
Okay,
have a couple other questions that we'll get to. So this one should be a quick snapper. Can you require an employee to be assessed by an SUE after a positive test result?
If it's in your policy, absolutely.
Okay.
Now, what normally happens, just I'll tell you, often I get called when that's exactly what's happened. If you're doing testing, you should have a policy anyway to begin with. And most of the time, it's not as comprehensive as it needs to be, and it's not as balanced as it needs to be. But that should be an integral part of your policy so that your people know. When I get called and someone's got someone who had a positive test or who they're concerned has a substance use problem, it's usually never in the policy. So I help walk them through the process that I've described to you. And then once we get the person where they need to be and then they're settled and things are going well, then we go back and say, okay, now we need to put those pieces in place so that the next time this happens, heaven forbid, but it probably will, then you've already got that process in your policy. And that will go a long way to your whole workplace, knowing that you are supportive, not punitive related to this sort of thing. Because as well as I do, most workplaces, people chatter, and things like this are known.
Sure. Great. Thank you for the question, Addie. Another question here from Kathy. A friend of mine was denied a job as she had to do a drug test. She was upfront with them that she was on anxiety and depression meds. They said it showed up on the test, so they couldn't hire her. She takes nothing else, doesn't drink. She still thinks she should take it to someone to fight. Should take that to fight the decision. Thoughts?
Okay, so first of all, it's really hard for me to answer without knowing what the drugs are. But I would suspect
Okay.
if she's taking medication for anxiety and depression, that they would not be drugs that any employer would routinely be testing for. And she can certainly ask what showed up on the drug test. I mean, it's her drug test. She should have access to that information. And that is a situation where there may be merit in following it up with an employment lawyer, someone who has expertise in that area. I'm not saying that it's an absolute, because I would need to have more information, but generally that's a discriminatory practice.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up from Addie. Any recommendations on SUEs that are local to Atlantic Canada?
I have a few, and there is a source that's quite helpful, but you still need to vet people. So Annie, if you want to follow up with me afterwards, it's probably easier if we have a conversation. I can give you some of the things that you need to be looking for, and I can give you some suggestions too.
Great. So those are the questions that came in during our call. So we have 4 minutes left. So maybe we want to, because I think you did a very good job. You answered the 3 questions that I had come up during the session. My mind went, so there's so much in there that we covered in 48 minutes. So that was fantastic. Any, I guess, closing remarks, Nadine?
My mind is going back to the situation of the person needing to be off work to get help, to be able to do what they needed to do to be healthy, to come back to work. And I know, because I encounter it all the time, that employers think, well, why am I paying for someone else's issue? And well, it's a medical condition. And, you would support as much as you could an individual who had cancer or had a diabetic problem or heart disease or anything like that. It really is important to think about the bigger picture. Do you value this employee and any employee who's in a circumstance like this? And how much is it going to cost you to cover maybe a limited amount of treatment, which is probably that's generally what I experience when you have that external person identifying what needs to happen. So it's a short-term thing. It's not like it's going to go on for years and years and years. And balance that with how much it would cost to hire a new employee. Now, I don't know the numbers on that, but I know that the latter is much higher than generally it would ever be required to pay for someone's, or partially pay for someone's treatment. How it normally happens under best practices is an employer will fit the bill completely the first time, and that's often offset by some of the extended health benefits that an employer may have. Not everyone has that. I recognize that. If there is a relapse and something happens and there's a positive test in the future, then it's cost shared 50-50. And the third time, if there is a third time and the employer tolerates that, then they can expect the employee to pay the full amount. That's generally how it happens. Now, even if you're in the first circumstance, depending on what you negotiate with your people or what you feel is fair, you may be able to garnish their wages when they come back to work and at least recoup some of that. Every situation is different. So sure. I would encourage you to think about what is best for what message do you want to send, and what is best for the overall well-being and the culture of your organization? Because substance use is real. It's at least 20% of the population, self-reported, so I know it's more. And if you think you don't have a problem, you're not aware of what's really going on. That would be my parting comment.
Thank you, Nadine. Well, this was very educational. We're looking forward to working with Nadine going into 2026 to perhaps expand our offering in this space. So if folks have questions, comments, ideas, concerns, our team at Construction Safety Nova Scotia will be following up with a survey after today's session. This will be posted, I said, on our website, and please take a screenshot of our last slide up here for further contact information. So we'll give you 1 minute back to finish your lunch, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks very much.
Seeing the claps and the thumbs up. This is great. Thanks everyone for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. I would look forward to speaking with anybody who has questions that didn't come up or I didn't answer today that might still be lingering. So Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Darren and Kayla and Bobby, who helped me with all of this. They made it very easy. I just had to sit here and talk. And I was telling them earlier that that is highly unusual and not the norm. So they're a great group of people to work with. If the rest of you ever have anything that you think you might want to approach them in this regard. So there, Darren, you didn't know I was going to say
Awesome.
that, did you?
I love it. Great sales plug. Thanks again. See everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Be safe.
Happy to be spreading